The Infralapsarian Supralapsarian debate. This is a particular theological discussion that is very confusing for a lot of people, especially from outside of the Reformed tradition, because this is one of those debates that is very much an intramural one within Calvinism. And so those of other traditions, even when they're speaking about these discussions and debates, tend not to understand them because those like myself, coming from a different tradition, the Lutheran tradition, we're not using the same categories. So this is an explanation of kind of what those terms mean, and when people are using those terms, exactly what they're talking about. Now, when we're talking about infralapsarian and supralapsarian, what the discussion surrounds is the nature of God's decrees, and this is a very technical discussion. And we are talking about the logical order of God's decrees. Now, it's important to recognize that logical order of decrees is not the same thing as talking about a temporal order of God's decrees. And so it's not that God decrees one thing at one time and then this many years later he decrees this other thing. But we're talking about the logical order, or of what is the cause of what. And so let's get into the discussion and talk about exactly what's going on here in the infralapsarian and supralapsarian discussions. Well, lapsus is the Latin term for fall. Meaning the fall of Adam and Eve, the fall of humanity into sin. And so when we're talking about these discussions, it's the logical order of God's decrees of election and reprobation, in particular, in relation to God's decree of the fall. Because in Calvinism, God decrees the fall of mankind into sin. And so the question is the decree of election and reprobation prior to the decree of the fall, or does it follow logically after the decree of the fall? And so the position that's known as the more moderate Calvinist position is the infralapsarian one, which says this, that first God decrees the fall. Second, again in the logical, not temporal order of things, God decrees that he is going to elect some of that fallen mass of humanity unto eternal salvation. And those are the individuals that are then the elect. They're the predestined. Those are those who are going to be finally saved. And so in this view, reprobation, or kind of the negative side of election, is more of a passive thing rather than an active one, in that God is choosing to leave the non-elect in their sin and not offer grace to them. He is not actively hardening their hearts. Now, the other position is the supralapsarian position, or above the fall, infra meaning after the fall. Okay, supralapsarian is before the fall, so that the decree of election and reprobation occurs prior to the fall. And so this is the view of high Calvinism, which is also the view that's adopted in hyper-Calvinism, but not all that are supralapsarians are hyper-Calvinists. So supralapsarianism says this, that God desires to demonstrate his mercy and his wrath through the act of election and reprobation. Therefore, he decrees the fall so that he can demonstrate both his mercy and his wrath through those acts of election and reprobation. So the fall then is not the election is not in view of sin. Reprobation is not in view of sin. Sin is brought into the world so that God can bring forth that decree of election and reprobation. And so this is a view that says that God is much more active in condemning the reprobate unto eternal damnation. That is the supralapsarian position. So it's always been the case that the supralapsarian position is the less popular one. It's the more extreme form, the higher form of Calvinism. It was taught popularly by Theodore Beza, who was Calvin's successor, and it has been taught by people like Abraham Kuyper and some other very prominent Reformed figures. But the infralapsarian position is pretty clearly that of John Calvin himself, and is seemingly reflected in the wording of things like the Westminster Confession of Faith, though there were supralapsarians on the Westminster Assembly also. In recent years, these discussions have continued within Calvinism. Raymond Brown is somebody who's an example of one who has promoted a kind of supralapsarianism, though he calls it a modified supralapsarian, so it's not exactly the same as the older view. Still today, among the confessionally reformed, the infralapsarian view tends to be the more predominant one, but there have been those who just kind of say that really this discussion shouldn't be had in the first place. It's all speculative, and it's really not a beneficial discussion at all. So many people take that position as well, to say that it's really not even something that we should be delving into, trying to figure out these particularities. The Reformed theologian, the neo-Orthodox Reformed theologian Karl Barth, promoted a kind of supralapsarianism, at least he labeled it that. But really the categories of neo-Orthodoxy are so different from the confessionally Reformed position that I don't even know if you can really label it a kind of supralapsarianism. It's kind of a whole separate discussion altogether when you get into Karl Barth's doctrine of election. So hopefully you found this explanation helpful, and if you run across these terms in different writings or people are talking about them, now hopefully you have just a kind of general idea of exactly what it is they're talking about. If you like this and want to hear more about theological terms, check out our Theology video encyclopedia that this is a part of. You can help this project out also by going to patreon.com/JustinSinner. If you like this, make sure that you like the video, you subscribe, and you check out our other videos. All right, we'll see you next time. God bless.